So you want to start your lead pouring journey, but you're not quite sure where to start. Well, get ready because this is Lead Pouring 101. That's right, folks. For all you new to the channel, my name is Jacob. This is Into the Woods Custom Lures. So I'm going to start. This is going to be part one of a multi-part video series trying to cover everything related to lead molds, lead pouring, making your own jigs, and try to help give you guys the confidence to get started. There are a ton of channels and information on the soft plastic side of things, so all of that is pretty well covered everywhere. However, there's not a ton of information on the lead side of things, which kind of prevents people from wanting to get started. It can be kind of intimidating, a little daunting to try to take that step to pouring your own. There's tons of molds, a million different hook options, and people just aren't quite sure where to start. The number one question that I get, that I see on other channels, that I see on Facebook pages and everywhere is, what mold do I get? How do I start? What mold do I need to pick? So today we're going to try to give you all the information, cover the key features of the molds, all the things you need to look for as far as components and hardware and hooks, and give you all the information that you need to help you select the right mold. So when it comes to selecting a mold, the biggest thing is you need to select a mold that fits the style of fishing you're doing. Now I know that sounds pretty self-explanatory, but there are a lot of people that just don't know which one to pick, or maybe they're new to jig fishing in general. Some people view jig fishing as a very intimidating topic. They kind of view that in the same way that other people view giant swim baits. It's intimidating to some people. So I'm going to kind of try to give you the basic information that you need to know to pick the right jig to fit your style. For example, if you're fishing around grass, you're going to want a jig with a more pointed triangular shaped head. I would recommend getting one with a vertical line tie. A vertical line tie and a triangular shaped head is going to allow that jig to come through grass much easier. For example, they make the Trocar swim jig. That jig has a horizontal line tie. My personal preference is I would prefer a vertical. So you can look at something like the poison tail or the casting jig or the hybrid grass jig. Those are some of your great swim jig options with a vertical line tie. If you're fishing around a lot of rock and hard bottom, that's where your football jigs really come into play. A football jig has a wide footprint up front where the bait is actually making contact with the rock. That wide footprint is going to help that jig from falling into cracks in between rocks and getting stuck. Now, if you're fishing around wood and brush piles and stuff, what you're going to want to look at is take a jig like the brush jig, for example. Where that jig comes in contact with the bottom or wood or whatever you're fishing around, it has a wider footprint. What that's going to do is and it's not just that it's wide, but it's flat. What that's going to do is that's going to keep your jig upright. Generally speaking, when you get snagged on the hook on something, it's because your jig rolls over to the side, and as it comes over, your hook catches. If you have a jig that is flat and wide on the bottom, it's going to help that jig stay vertical and upright while coming over the log or lay down or whatever and keep you snag free. Now, there's no perfect jig out there that's going to let you throw it right into the middle of a brush pile and never get snagged, but you can optimize your chances by selecting the right jig. Now, some of the small components or subcategories within those categories that you need to take in mind are hook options. So hook options are huge. I'm a slight hook snob, so if I find a jig that I like, but none of the hooks that fit that jig are hooks that I like or have confidence in, I'm not going to get that jig. There's one thing between your line and that fish, and that's the hook. Once you hook a fish, the head style, the weed guard, the skirt pattern, all that stuff is irrelevant. You need a hook that you have confidence in that once you set the hook, you're getting that fish in. So hook options are a huge one. So for those of you that have been around for a while, you've probably seen Do It Molds is starting to design molds where without modification, the only hooks that fit those molds are Victory hooks. So if you're somebody who doesn't like Victory hooks, maybe you prefer Owner or Gamakatsu or BKK or whatever the case may be, you need to take that into consideration when selecting a mold. Now, that's what I like about buying most of my stuff from Barlow's. When you click on a mold on their website, you can scroll down and they'll show you a chart of all the hooks without modification that will fit in that mold. Now, hooks, I would say, is the biggest, most critical factor for me when selecting a mold. Now, I will modify a lot of molds to fit the hook that I like. I'll have an in-depth video on that later on, so don't worry, we'll cover all that later. But if you're just wanting to buy a mold, drop in a hook that fits and go, look at your hook options and make sure that you like the design of the jig and the hook, because if you only like one or the other, you're probably not going to enjoy this as much as you could. Now, the next thing to look at is, are you wanting a skirted jig? Does the jig that you're looking at have a spot for the skirt and a bait keeper, or does it only have one or the other? Some molds will only have a spot for a skirt or will only have a spot for the bait keeper and not both. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Don't forget about the power of an old school catalog. I love having a catalog because a lot of times they will put similar style jigs on the same page, and it makes it a little easier to look at those jigs side by side and determine which one you like the best. Most catalogs, you can go to a company's website, put in your mailing address, they'll send you one for free. So don't forget, catalogs can be a very helpful tool when comparing those jigs, and sometimes it's just easier to see. Bait keepers is another critical component to look at, and the reason I say critical is because some jig heads have screw lock keepers. Well, if you're a fan of Z-Man and Elastec as a trailer, you'll never get your Elastec on a screw lock keeper. I'm sure a lot of you already know that, but you're going to need to go with something with a lead keeper or a wire keeper. The other thing with keepers, this is just a personal preference of mine. This is something that I learned from Tactical Bassin several years ago. If I have two identical molds and one of them has a lead keeper, wire keeper, whatever on the top, and one has it on the bottom, I'm going to take the one on the bottom every single time. The reason being, when you catch a fish, that fish's lip, if you hook them in the top of the mouth, that fish's lip is going to be rubbing on the top side of that jig. If you've got an aggressive keeper right there, they're just going to grind your soft plastic trailer against that keeper, rip it off, and you're going to go through a lot more soft plastics for your trailers. If you have that keeper on the bottom and it's smoother on the top, it's going to make your trailer last a lot longer. I know that sounds very minor, and in reality it is, because let's be honest, most of us are probably not catching so many fish that that's going to make that much of a difference. That's just a personal preference that I like. If I have the option, I prefer keepers on the bottom. An example, look at the hybrid grass jig. It has very aggressive keepers on both sides, top and bottom. Well, say you're like me and you have a preference against that, you can actually just cut that keeper off the top. You have just a keeper on the bottom, or vice versa. Whatever your preference is, it doesn't matter. You can do it however you want. Another thing to keep in mind when selecting the right mold is the weight of the cavities within that mold. So I'll go back to this hybrid grass jig, for example. It's a great jig. However, they only make this jig in a 3/8 up to a 3/4 ounce. So if you're an angler that fishes from the bank a lot, or maybe you fish a lot of shallow water, a lot of farm ponds, or little privately owned ponds, a 3/8 ounce jig might be too heavy for you. So a hybrid grass jig might not work for you. Even though it is a great jig and a great option, it's not going to suit everyone and the type of fishing that they do. So you're going to want to look at the cavity count, or the cavity sizes that they offer in that mold. Now, it can be annoying, but it's great marketing on DeWitt's part. I would say 3/8 and 1/2 ounce are probably your most common sizes in most jigs that are used. What they do on a lot of molds is they'll go from a say an 1/8 ounce up to a 3/8, and then their next mold starts at half and goes up to larger sizes, kind of forcing you to buy 2 molds to get your 3/8 and your half. So if you're on a very strict budget, that's another thing to look at. Does the style of jig that you're looking for, do they make a mold that has the sizes that you're going to use, or all of the sizes, or are you going to have to buy multiple molds? Because that can also, like I said, if you're on a very strict budget, that can determine which route you go. If you're fishing from the bank, you like my artwork, if you're fishing from the bank, a lot of times you're casting out to deeper water and dragging uphill, so you're going to want a lighter jig. It's going to keep you from getting snagged as much. Fishing from a boat, you're typically casting a little shallower and dragging it down deep, so you're going to need a heavier jig to maintain bottom contact. So the weights of the jigs are going to be something that you need to take into consideration as well. And again, I can't tell you the magic number like you need this size or that size. It's all going to be dependent on what you fish. So if you're not sure, just think the next time you go out fishing, even if say you're throwing a Texas rig, if you're throwing just a 1/4 ounce Texas rig weight and you're staying on bottom really well and you feel like that's a good weight, well then find a jig that's a 1/4 ounce or something very similar, and that's going to kind of give you a good starting point on which mold and direction that you need to go. So that's just kind of a rough outline of things that I look for when picking a specific mold for a specific situation. I know somebody's going to be wishing that I would have said you need this mold or you need that mold. So what I'm going to do, in the video description, I'll break it down into 3 categories. Or I'll do 4 categories. I'll do grass, wood, rocks, and open water. And I'll link 2 of my favorite molds for each category for you to take a look at. But the thing with this is I'm not trying to force a product on you or tell you you need this or I'm trying to get you to understand what to look for so you can make that decision for yourself. Fishing, as you all know, is probably one of the most opinionated sports that there are. So I'm not going to try to tell you you need to do this. I have very strong opinions on all of these topics, but I don't need to force my opinion on you. I just want you to have a better understanding of things to look for so you can form your own opinions and get what you like to do. What I like may not be what you like and vice versa. And that's the great thing about making your own. You can make exactly what you want. You can get the head style you want, get the exact hook you want. You can do all of that and make all of those decisions for yourself. So hopefully this gives you kind of an understanding on things to look for selecting the mold that's going to work best for you. This is part 1. Part 2 is going to be an in-depth dive on hooks. I feel like hooks is probably one of the most important critical features of pouring lead in general. There's one thing between your line and that fish, and that is your hook. So you want to make sure you're selecting the right hooks for each application. But with all that being said, hopefully this helped you guys just kind of have an understanding on what to look for with jig molds. Hopefully you liked it. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and we'll have part 2 coming out very soon.